Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am Kris. I apologize if it looks a little weird. It looks good right now. I mean, me, but not that way. I had a power outage last night, like 3 or 4 times. It was one of those out, back on, and of course, it resets my. I don't understand this, but it resets my program for recording, and it looks much better right now. I have to say. I'm always like slightly off camera. Looks much better right now. I mean, that's always going to be an issue, but yeah, I like that. I think it looks really good. All right. It took me about 5 minutes of just guessing hue, brightness, and all that stuff. Don't know what any of it was. Don't even remember. It'll happen again. I'll have to redo the whole thing. Okay. Has nothing to do with this. This is China's man-made islands are sinking from war fronts. I saw this video pop up several times, never did it. Saw it again pop up last night and made a note that I want to cover that because I remember them building the islands and then I didn't remember anything else about it. So, we're going to do it. By we, you don't have to be here if you don't want to. I understand. But I'm going to do this. If you can click that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, helps me out. And there's a thanks button there. You can click on that, donate to the channel if you'd like. I'm going to shut up and let's get into the video.
Have you ever heard of the South China Sea? If not, it probably won't require too much imagination to locate on the map. If your first instinct would be to describe it as a sea located south of China, you would be right. The South China Sea is an area of some major economic and strategic importance. According to a brief by the Energy Information Administration, the sea is a goldmine of various highly valued resources. It is one of the most densely packed fishing spots in the world and is also thought to be abundant with hydrocarbons, including natural gas. Despite this, the exact extent of its economic potential, especially in terms of its natural gas reserves, are not yet known. This is because the sea has been underexplored for years. And the reason for this hinges around bitter territorial disputes concerning sovereignty over the area, which have only gained pace in the last few years. Among the many parties to the dispute are each of the countries with nearby coastlines and also some with not very nearby coastlines. Countries with some claims to the area include China, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam, and even Taiwan. But perhaps the most belligerent party to the ongoing disputes is the People's Republic of China, which seemingly decided to shut down the arguments by establishing sovereignty over the sea outright. How has it done that? By claiming and militarizing a series of islands, some of which China has simply dredged up out of thin air.
Just before we continue with today's video, have you ever wondered, Simon, how do you make these videos so quickly? Well, for gamer sent me so many drink wing, it just happened.
It's first gamer subs. And back to today's episode.
I do mine with iced tea and occasionally beer.
But before we get there, it's first important to identify just why there is so much furor over a sea with, at best, a few minor islets barely fit for human habitation, and to find out who are the players with a hand in this dispute. Simply put, whoever controls the South China Sea also holds control over the transit which passes through it. It just so happens that that transit connects some of the most significant maritime trade routes in the world. Among the major ports located at various ends of the sea are Manila, Singapore City, Kuala Lumpur, Ho Chi Minh City, Taipei, and more. Huge volumes of cargo pass through this route to each of these cities and nations, and that trade is thought to be up to 1/3 of global maritime traffic, carrying goods worth up to $3 trillion annually. It's also thought that the South China Sea is responsible for some 12% of the entire world's annual fishing catch, despite being only 2% of the sea volume of the globe. This makes it one of the most abundant fishing sites in the world. And if that weren't enough, there is a massive abundance of oil in the sea. Although the dispute has made determining exact quantities difficult, it is thought that the sea contains around 11 billion barrels of oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, although, as mentioned before, this is subject to further exploration to determine the true amount. However, with so much trade and natural resources at stake, this has meant that control over the South China Sea has evolved into a bitter diplomatic dispute, one which has only become more and more bitter as the past few years have progressed. China's strategic presence in the area is centered on a number of islands which it de facto controls, namely the Paracel Islands and parts of an archipelago known as the Spratlys. The Spratly Islands are the most major source of all the upheaval. They're located about 1,000 kilometers away from mainland China and about 960 kilometers from its nearest uncontested parcel of territory. The closest shoreline to any of the islands happens to belong to China's biggest rival for control of the Spratlys, the Philippines, whose outlying island of Palawan is located almost within reach of some of the smallest islets of the archipelago. Despite this, as mentioned before, claimants to the islands are not short in number, and some of the shoals and reefs are controlled by many of the surrounding countries with stakes in the future of the sea. This includes Vietnam, Taiwan, Malaysia, the Philippines, and the Sultanate of Brunei. Practically all of these have built constructions of some kind on their respective islands except for Brunei. China's claim to the islands relates to a rather dubious document known as the Nine-Dash Line. This map appeared in the year 1946, just as the Chinese Civil War had reignited and was beginning to move in the Chinese Communist Party's favor. Ironically, the map was conceived not by the PRC, but by the Republic of China, Taiwan's predecessor, and originally appeared as a map with 11 dashes incorporating a total of 90% of the South China Sea's maritime territory, various islands, as well as half of the Gulf of Tonkin, which separates China and Vietnam. However, following the defeat of the Republic of China, Mao Zedong decided to relinquish the claim to the Gulf so as to not annoy the Vietnamese, with whom China was beginning to have closer and closer ties. 2 dashes were dropped from this map and the Nine-Dash Line was born instead. The Nine-Dash Line has been the source of great controversy, and despite its highly dubious origins, it continues to be passionately proclaimed by the People's Republic of China as a valid document attesting its ownership of the maritime region. The claims are complicated, and so we won't attempt to pick them apart in full during this video, but largely hinge on the presumed inhabitation of Chinese civilizations of the area going back millennia, based mostly on circumstantial evidence such as some recovered artifacts and obscure and difficult to translate texts, which seem to suggest some kind of Chinese presence there thousands of years ago. However, the existence of these civilizations has been dismissed by some observers as simply mythological. But this doesn't stop China, and its preoccupation with safeguarding what it sees as its territory extends all the way down to its domestic school system. As Time described, Chinese schoolchildren are taught that the furthest extent of their territory is Zhengmu in the South Spratlys, which lies roughly 80 kilometers off the coast of Malaysia, and which isn't actually even an island, but it's rather just an underwater shoal. It is this sort of obsession which resulted in the emergence of China's militarized man-made islands in the area. But despite all this current furor, the South China Sea dispute didn't really ignite until the 21st century. Until then, the sea was presumed to be a big body of water like any other, with a few uninhabitable islands and otherwise nothing but lots and lots of water. But the dispute was actually set in motion years before by a group of fishermen originating from perhaps China's biggest rival for the islands, the Philippines. In 1947, a group of Filipino fishermen floated near the uninhabited Spratly Island archipelago and discovered that it was abundant in fish. One of these, Thomas Clymer, claimed the island as an independent micronation and his own sovereign territory, and proceeded to reside on the islands with his buddies, becoming fabulously wealthy along the way.
You can do that? I'm going to claim my next door neighbor's backyard, if that's the case. You're all invited to the party. You got to get there before they bring out their shotguns, apparently.
Through its untouched supplies of fish. The territory, under Clymer, adopted the phenomenal title of the Free Territory of Freedom Land and existed as an unrecognized state for the next 18 years. It lasted until 1974, when the Filipino government saw the fishing potential of the islands, kicked Clymer off, and annexed the area. The Philippines formally declared the islands part of its territory in 1978. However, soon, they weren't the only ones becoming interested. By that time, the CCP had defeated the nationalist Kuomintang party and driven them to Taiwan, and had been in the process of state building for several decades. Much of China's desire to define itself centered around what it called the Century of Humiliation, the period between 1839 and 1949, wherein China was occupied and divided up by a vast range of different entities. Along the way, China suffered a number of military defeats and atrocity after atrocity, and this sequence of victimhood was something that the state had decided would never occur again. This in turn lent itself to an aggressive sort of foreign policy, which arguably continues until this day. And China soon had its sights firmly set on the sea. China first reasserted its claim to the Paracel Islands, located in the north part of the sea, the same year that the Philippines expelled Thomas Clymer in 1974. It immediately built its first military installations, including an airfield and an artificial harbour on the Paracel's largest island, Woody Island, that same year. Shortly afterwards, North Vietnam triumphed in the Vietnamese Civil War and claimed the Paracels for itself, locking it into a dispute with China that has endured until today. Before long, relations between the two countries had deteriorated to the extent that they engaged in a month-long border war in 1979, albeit one which didn't result in any substantial territorial changes. In the meantime, further south, the Philippines discovered oil off Palawan, which proved the economic potential of the sea, in addition to its unfolding importance as a maritime trade passage. By 1992, China passed a piece of legislation called the Law on the Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone, which reasserted its claim to the entire South China Sea based on civilizations dating back to the Western Han Dynasty, existing between 200 BC to 9 CE. Consistent with its hang-up about the century of humiliation, China has been on something of a military mega-drive in recent years, driven in part by its desire to be the most potent military force in the world by 2049, the 100-year anniversary of the clinching of power by the Chinese Communist Party. But despite all its historical claims, China's claims to the sea haven't really been well received externally, and much less has the military hardware it's installing there. Most obviously, the islands are located nowhere near mainland China, deep in the South China Sea, and closer by some distance to the coastline of Vietnam, the Philippines, and Malaysia. At a quick glance, it would appear understandable why this maritime territory would be contested, given the vast network of islands claimed by different entities present in the area. But a look at the map would suggest that China would have, of all, the weakest claim to the area, if it had any claim at all. Moreover, the legitimacy of China's 9-dash map was rejected by the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague in 2016, which determined China's claims to be baseless and pointed instead to the supremacy of both international maritime law and the exclusive economic zones of the nations party to the dispute. The CCP reacted with fury to the court's ruling, rejecting the decision and instead doubling down on its claims. It did so by continuing to use the 9-dash map in all its positioning as regards to the South China Sea, expanding it back to 10 dashes to accentuate its claim to Taiwan, of course, and kickstarting a fervent academic and educational drive behind the validity of the map. But more practically, it did so by pressing ahead to transform the islands it occupied through ambitious militarization projects and deciding to pursue a project of land reclamation and establishment of man-made islands to meet its strategic goals.
I didn't realize that the Hague turned it down, yeah. Can't really claim a territory like that when everyone's using it for not transport, but everyone, ships are going through there. You can't just claim it. Doesn't really work that way. I want to get to the islands though, because I didn't know they were sinking.
So, China hauled in its mechanic teams and set to work. Already ahead of The Hague's ruling, by 2013, the project took form as China began to uproot and clear away coastal reefs and mangroves on the islands it occupied through a process known as dredging. In order to create inhabitable islands from the isolated sequence of rocks, China needed to first clear and establish a base for construction. And at least this part of the mission went very effectively. Dredging is a hell of a process. It is costly and requires massive mechanical equipment to clear away seafloor debris and with it, marine life and natural vegetation.
They wanted to dredge where I'm at, the Illinois River, because it meets into the Mississippi and it's loaded with silt. Back in the 1600s, it was beautiful and blue, but now it's dirty because that's what men do. So they wanted to dredge it, and there's one area where they did dredge it so that they could have barges still be able to come through. And they built a little island that you're not supposed to go to. There's trees and all kinds of stuff growing up. It's pretty neat. But yeah, they had to dredge that up to build the island there. Illinois River isn't very deep. I mean, some estimates it's like 9 foot deep at the deepest parts. But yeah, that silt, you just step on it, you just feel yourself sinking into it. It's kind of creepy thinking about it now.
China has proven adept at it, cutting through the vegetation at rapid speed and quickly clearing a seafloor fit for the application of landfill. The The process it employs in the South China Sea is to slice up the reef and then pump sediment, such as gravel and sand, through pipes into the newly cleared shallow areas. This process disturbs the seafloor, eliminating marine life and overwhelming the coral reef's capacity to repair itself. And the massive cost to the environment is also something that has bitten China back, as we shall see a little later in the video. It is on this artificially created platform that China has managed to make the atolls into islands fit for human habitation and infrastructure. On woody islands in the Paracels, China built modern dwellings, a primary school, a bank, a hospital, and installed mobile communications. It also built an airport, and tourists have been able to visit. It further established communities on the islands, mostly fishermen brought in to exploit the potential of the area. In all, China has reclaimed and converted 7 islands from the sea into habitable locations, reclaiming a total area of around 13.5 square kilometers between the 2 island groups. It is in the Spratlys, however, that China's initiatives have a more nefarious profile. By 2022, China fully militarized the 3 largest reefs there: Subby Reef, Mischief Reef, and Fiery Cross Reef. China has justified its construction by claiming the islands are its territory and therefore fall within its exclusive economic zone, and that therefore what it chooses to build there is not really anybody's business. It has also downplayed the military side of the operation, claiming that the projects being built there are largely serving economic purposes. According to China, the structures it has built in the Spratlys are residences for fishermen, refugees, for maritime wayfarers, and things of that nature. However, satellite images seem to suggest otherwise, suggesting that China has deployed fighter jets, cruise missiles, as well as airfields fit for military hardware, as well as a radar system. It has been further claimed that the so-called fishermen that inhabit the islands are not really fishermen at all, with some analysts concluding that the figures appearing on satellite images, nicknamed Little Blue Men, are actually Chinese military and naval staff strategically positioned so as to cause disruption to maritime trade routes and wreak havoc with the delicate diplomatic balance in the South China Sea. China has stacked the islands with advanced military defense systems such as anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile systems, laser and jamming equipment, and fighter jets, as well as the aforementioned landing strips capable of hosting heavy-duty aerial bombers and other ominous additions. And naturally, China's building operations and aggressive stance in the area has caused huge and worsening diplomatic tensions with multiple countries. In addition to its long-standing disputes with Vietnam, the Philippines emerged as a bitter enemy of China in the 1990s, when loggerheads between the 2 nations in the Spratlys nearly evolved into open conflict. The first occasion when the Philippines noticed China's intentions were with its militarization of Mischief Reef in 1996. That year, 3 Chinese naval vessels fought a brief battle with a Philippine Navy gunboat near the reef in an incident which marked the first time China engaged in a confrontation with an ASEAN member other than Vietnam. The clash triggered a crisis in Sino-Philippine relations and revived US-Philippine military ties. The dispute has only intensified since then, exacerbated by China's construction of the man-made islands and its increasingly hostile actions against the vessels of other countries, which continued in the past year through several dangerous skirmishes with Filipino ships, which we actually covered in a Situation Room update quite recently. You can check it out if you want to.
So is China just bullying all the countries in that region? Because I know they're having issues with Australia now. So are they just bullying everyone to try to be the top dog in that area? Especially out in the water. You know, they got issues with Taiwan, Vietnam, not Panama. Oh my goodness. Why is it that that kind of, you know, that area. Wow, wow.
Even from a Chinese point of view, there are several problems with the project which render the whole thing potentially a bit pointless. For one thing, everyone's rather cheesed off with China for its actions in the South China Sea, coming at a significant and potentially unjustifiable cost to its diplomatic interests. Opposition to its projects has come not only from its historical enemies and rivals such as Taiwan, the Philippines, and the United States, but even other countries not directly within the sphere of influence of its rivals. In Vietnam, anti-Chinese protests exploded in 2014 after China installed an oil rig close to the Paracel Islands in a location within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. The protests resulted in the torching of 15 Chinese-owned factories and left 21 people dead. Even Japan has gotten involved, criticizing China's attempts to turn the sea into what it called Lake Beijing,
I forgot about Japan too, yeah.
shoring up its military budget and proposing security cooperation with the United States, India, and Australia that would, quote, safeguard.
Oh my goodness. Puerto Rico. When I said Panama, Puerto Rico is what I was thinking of. Just, wow.
The maritime commons stretching from the Indian Ocean region to the Western Pacific. Also, while China has, on occasion, made some rather inconsistent references to the islands being part of its exclusive economic zone, any reference it makes to international law is a sort of double-edged sword. As mentioned before, an international court ruling rejected China's territorial claims based on its 9-dash line, which, if China accepts the supremacy of the EEZs, it must, logically, also accept the court's ruling about its historical claims being complete hogwash. Moreover, there is another ruling which works both for and mostly against China's claims. An international tribunal declared that some of the disputed islands weren't legally islands at all, but were instead low-tide elevations that did not afford any legal entitlement to exclusive economic zones or appropriation of any kinds. In theory, this could work in China's favor. After all, how could China's construction and militarization of these islands be wrong if there are no islands to begin with? However, this would also mean that the exclusive economic zones applied to the islands would fall within the territory of the nearest uncontested coastline, which would leave at least some of China's constructions in the area belonging to the Philippines and Vietnam in particular. It also means that the islands would not be subject to China's territorial boundaries and that China could have.
When I said Puerto Rico, maybe I was thinking the Philippines. I am just off today. Mentally, I'm off.
No objection either to the Philippines or US ships making passage through the area under the principles of freedom of navigation. This would mean relative passage through the area.
That is beautiful, though. That is really nice.
Under the principles of freedom of navigation. This would mean relative freedom for the Philippines to continue its fishing operations and for the US to conduct so-called freedom of navigation operations, or FONOPs, which are observational voyages sanctioned under international law intended to survey and challenge excessive maritime claims. But another problem lies with the man-made islands in the Spratlys. Some of these structures are just not very sound. While China has proven itself to be top-notch at dredging, often with wanton or scant regard for marine life and ecology, it hasn't been quite as good at building secure infrastructures built to last on its new islands. You see, the work that has gone into building the islands, while fast-paced, has been shoddy. Questions have arisen about the kind of cement used by China in the development of its project, which is thought not to be able to withstand the particularly abrasive conditions of the South China Sea. As Bloomberg reported, the kind of cement derived from sea sand is not very robust and might even cause buildings to collapse. China has used this kind of cement in building projects elsewhere, where it has also received criticism. But its use in the precarious climate of the sea represents an even more acute risk still. But it is possible that even if these projects had been soundly built, they would not have lasted long. It seems that China, amidst its aggressive policies, has chosen one enemy that it may simply be no match for: the force of nature. Simply put, the sea
I almost said Mother Nature. Damn.
is eating away at China's islands. China's dredging has been characterized by a particular scant regard for the environment, by removing large chunks of flora and piling heaps of debris upon what remains. But the native mangroves, which China obliterated, operate as a kind of natural break, holding back the sea by absorbing tides and protecting the shores. Without that barrier, the islands are more exposed than normal to rising tides, which could in theory submerge the islands. Moreover, climate change threatens to undo the whole notion further. Rising seas are a threat to all islands, but especially low-lying and small islands without elevations into which the population could retreat as the coastline erodes. But China's man-made islands are simply too small and too flat for this to be any kind of possibility. Some Pacific islands have shored up their defense against the rising tides by building sea walls, structures designed to protect areas of human habitation from tides, waves, or tsunamis, and China hasn't. In addition, China's useless concrete risks speeding up the sinking of the islands. According to The Economist, the concrete used for land reclamation in the Spratlys has proven itself completely unfit for purpose, turning into sponge in the hostile climate of the sea. This makes the foundations of all that has been built upon them unreliable and risks failing to stem the rising waters. As a result, the islands are basically sliding into the sea, nature reclaiming what it gave up. Not only is this a source of embarrassment for China, but it will represent a rather significant waste of money that went into creating them in the first place. And if that weren't enough, the sea is continuing to rise, threatening to completely submerge China's upstart islands. China appears aware of this, and this is likely the reason why the islands don't appear to be particularly teeming with human life, while some of the military installations are rather limited, and its airports on the 3 militarized reefs show no sign of use for several years after they'd been built. And all this aside from the fact that China doesn't really have much experience in the building of structures designed to withstand the types of strong typhoons which can occur in the South China Sea. These typhoons are only likely to get more severe as global temperatures rise due to climate change, something which could simply pulverize the fragile structures on the islands if they took a direct hit. And if it is the case that if nature reclaims these islands, then all China's efforts will have come to a rather embarrassing failure. It stands worthy to mention that dredging and land reclamation doesn't come cheap, and although China doesn't release figures, it is thought that it spent upwards of $12 billion on its construction projects on one of the Spratlys, that's Fiery Cross Reef, alone. Thus, China's island creation could represent a kind of misadventure, proving costly both to its international prestige as well as to the exposed communities that it has placed there.
And they built 7 of them, 12 billion per. So you've got 84 billion. Yeah, 84 billion, give or take, probably 70 to 100 billion with, I don't know if that's just to build the island, because then you have all your stuff that they're building on top, on the island, trying to, for tourism and stuff like that. So yeah, they've invested a good amount of money. It's as crazy it is to say $100 billion isn't a whole lot for them. Oh, well, this is pretty good. I enjoyed this. I'm going to go ahead and end this here. Hope you enjoyed. Didn't talk a whole lot because I was just more interested in hearing what he had to say. So, till next time, have a good day, have a good night.